Enemies are often former or potential friends who have been denied or think they have been denied something. Okay? I think that phrase really sums it up, and I hope we'll see why as we proceed. So, and what motivated me was that working on the Middle East for over 30 years, completely intractable, everybody knows that, and realizing how complex the world had become, John has talked a lot about that, I decided I'm going to do something kind of basic. And what was that? I decided I'm going to go to people in the region who I trusted and respected from specific countries and ask them a really basic question, which is, what are your country's absolute red lines? What will your country live and die for? Okay? In other words, for the point of this conference, what'll take you to war or not? And so what I did is, before getting into how I did that, because that'll lead to the Russia-Ukraine discussion, I based it on an idea about who we are as human beings that comes from the United Kingdom, a paradigm that I'm quite familiar with called Human Givens. It's actually a paradigm for well-being, but it basically says we have very basic innate needs. I'll list them for you in a second. As we live life, if those aren't met, we become ultra anxious, aggressive, and we'll do almost anything to get them met, okay? And I thought, well, this might even apply at a larger political level. Interestingly, by the way, and I'll come back to that in a second, these needs include things like, according to the Human Givens, and you'll see how I apply this in politics, autonomy or the need for independence, meaning that relates to sacred values, belonging, which is identity politically, status, which I'm going to make a very big deal about today about Russia, attention, an interesting one, by the way. I mean, for another talk, I could make a case that North Korea does a lot of missile launches for attention and almost nothing else. Achievement and competence, which is terrifically important for any group trying to do anything. So what I did is I talked to people from Iran, Israel, and Egypt, and I got their red lines and related them to these needs. By complete coincidence, and this is not unimportant, I was also at a conference where Zarif, the former Iranian foreign minister, said what we need is a cognitive map of the region in order to get anywhere in the region. Now, what I developed was not a cognitive map, it was what I call an emotional cognitive map, which again relates to a lot of what's being said at this conference. And now, importantly, these are universal, which gives us possibly, with work, could give us a lingua franca. So if you have meaning and achievement or those needs, others will have it as well. Now, before I get any further, I wanted to just highlight another point, and then I'll show you the mapping I did in Iran, and then we'll jump to Russia and Ukraine. This is the cover of a book called The Commanding Self by a Sufi scholar called Idries Shah. Some of you might know him, quite a well-known writer. The reason I wanted to put this image up is because, I guess because I work on the Middle East, and a lot of things that are cut and dry on paper, like telling you it's all about meeting basic innate needs, it doesn't quite do it justice, because people go to war because they're highly inflamed and highly greedy. And to me, this idea, which comes from Sufi lore in Arabic called the Nafs al-Ammara, which means literally the self that commands, or the commanding self, this angry predatory creature, symbolized by this bronze cat, or tiger in this case, gives us an inclination of an idea of the kinds of motives that get inflamed in war. And I want to compare it to Jonathan Haid's excellent work, by the way, he's fantastic, but his use of the elephant as the creature that is the more irrational, that we don't control. I'm just making the case that when we're talking about conflict and war, it is a much more aggressive creature than an elephant. Now, this is what, just to give you an idea, okay, this is what the Iranians told me. And I did this again with Egypt and Israel. It's incomplete, but meaning I haven't done Saudi Arabia, I haven't done the Palestinians, but it was actually enough to get to a good point. I'm not going to go through it thoroughly, okay? I have all this for Egypt, Israel, and Iran. The Iranians told me we consider ourselves imperial equals only with Egypt and Turkey, i.e. everybody else is a bit riffraff. We have the memory and attitude of being a Persian empire, so culture is really important. The Islamic Republic is fighting against injustice and oppression and threat from other regional actors. We fear internal fragmentation. Regional balance should not ever be to Iran's detriment. Okay? Now, again, I just want to emphasize, these are things that they'll go to war for. Okay? Just so that's the purpose of this mapping. And as you can see, I relate them to basic innate needs. The reason for that is because if at some point I'm talking to an Iranian and I need a reframe of what they're after, I need to know what they're, if I can put it in my language, what they're really after. So if they say fear of fragmentation, that relates to internal security and a sense of Iranian identity. Okay? There's the full picture, I think. And there are other basic needs like linkage to the Shia in Iraq or Lebanon, which they don't want to be broken, and the fear of Sunni extremism. And then I also outlined in square boxes the indirect consequences of having those needs. For example, to make sure they have security, the use of proxies, or the issues that were really important for the Iranians as a result of having those needs. Example, the fight against injustice and oppression, Palestine. Okay? Now, this isn't about the Middle East. I want to rush to Russia and Ukraine, but I can tell you, to my shame in a way, I did this for the other two countries. I smashed them all together, didn't use any algorithms. Hassan just did it myself in a crude way. And actually, I could see and discuss this with analysts that there was a problem as a result of the mixture of the needs. And the problem, very, very honestly, is what we're living today. Okay? It just popped up that there were some really core needs not being attended to that would create a problem. We are now in it. The better news is I then played around with answers based upon the needs. I presented them to people like Crisis Group, and they told me I was crazy at the time. I now think that those ideas are absolutely essential for moving the Middle East forward if possible. Okay, enough about the Middle East. There's a few more there, but this isn't about that. Oh, let me actually not go there. So I want to use basic needs now to just discuss with you a bit how these could apply to Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. I have not yet, I've had some conversations, but I haven't done as thorough a job on these countries as I did on the Middle East, which I also know better in general. But in a way, I'm treating this as the beginning of a conversation. Would love your feedback. Interestingly, again, it did resonate very much with what Gabrielle said, okay? And some of these are the result of discussions, especially with Russians, by the way. Okay? For the Russians, the number one basic need not met is status. And this goes to the conversation we've already had, which relates to culture. What's driving them, and I had a very strange, I was in Moscow last November and heard the Russians saying exactly how angry they were at the West. I then talked to a very close Russian friend, and I said, look, what in the world can we do about this? And we discussed whether it could be about WMD or about European security. Nope. As soon as I said, well, what about talking about Western hegemony? She goes, that's it, don't even go any further, okay? Status, the Russians feel lower status than, now this is critical for where we're going, than the United States, not the West, it's the US. We have to accept that as a fact in their heads in order to move forward. Number two is security. Gabrielle made that point very, very well. And I'll come back later about the order of these and how they're connected. And number three is identity. Russians confuse their identity with Ukrainians. The difference between Russians and Ukrainians is, so I'm half Lebanese, and Lebanese and Syrians do that. And also I'm Canadian, and Canadians and Americans have strange identity confusion. So it's familiar to me, but Russians and Ukrainians is not there is not as clear identity lines, and the Russians play with that. And furthermore, their attitude towards Eastern Europe, as was raised earlier, in a way, regarding belonging, is in a way as if almost Eastern Europe belongs to us. So it's not that they are us, but that they belong to us, okay? But these three factors are the key that, so far, without doing a greater analysis like I did on Iran, that are driving the Russian motive to war. And I'm focusing on this for one reason. It is Russia that started the war. So we need to really understand why Russia went to war. Ukraine, it's in a way easier. One is security. They're an invaded country. It's an insecure situation. Number two is the desire to maintain autonomy or independence is crucial, not be completely controlled by another country. And number three, and ironically, I don't think the Russians intended this, is now the Ukrainians have a stronger national identity as a result of the war than before, and they will want to preserve that. So that's going to be driving them quite intensely. Now the West is trickier. And here, I go exactly where Gabrielle went, by the way, okay? Other than security for Eastern Europe, which is important, and for NATO members, because there's now that clash, that's one big need for the West. Let me suggest this, that I think what's driving the Western attitude towards Russia is success. The Western model is tremendously successful and therefore gives the West a high degree of status. It's mostly material success, which makes, and many of you made this point, which makes Westerners, political leaders especially, and even policymakers, blind to the emotional, cultural dimension of what they're doing. It's not inherent in the whole approach of the West, as all of you know. I describe it very sadly as a form of autism, and frankly, NATO expansion, despite its merits, even ideas of the EU ending up in Ukraine, okay, are autistic in the sense of not understanding how the Russians view that. Okay, there's a serious blind spot. Those are the main basic needs that will have to be attended to, in my view, if we're going to get out of the morass. Okay. Now things are not that easy. It's not as if we could just, even as a mediator, go and convince the leader to offer these things, and all of a sudden it's magical and it's done. We are, as you all know, in war mode, and war mode has many very negative characteristics. The sides have a need to win or to justify losses, so they're not easily going to give up whatever they're doing. Two, they're locked in groupthink. They need groupthink in order to win. They need that complete obsessive sense of, fixated drive. They can't be that flexible and reflective as we wish them to be, because they're trying to win. Okay? And that means a lack of flexibility mentally, which is natural in war, but very bad for making peace. And the final element is, as you all know, distrust, and they actually want to punish the other. And the punishment of the other is probably the biggest barrier to any serious dialogue between Russia and the West. The West is still in the mode, well, Russia contravened international law, it needs to be punished, end of story. That's not going to get us out. Okay? I think we all have to accept that these things, that mode of thinking, those elements I just mentioned, which I outlined here in more specificity for each of Russia. I don't think there's a huge need to go into these, by the way. Ukraine, we can, if need be, and the West. These are the barriers to moving forward, okay? But they are not going to provide us any solution. In fact, and this is quite important for anybody who works in conflict resolution, because these barriers are there, the distrust, the anger, the desire to justify any losses already incurred, and the desire to punish, what tends to happen is what I call tactical diplomacy, okay? So you don't get strategic diplomacy that aims for answers, you get diplomacy that tries to mitigate the situation and try to get any win possible. Despite its benefits, I consider the grain deal, the grain deal that was cut at the beginning of the war, exactly that kind of thing. And what I'm really suggesting here is, if one wants to end war, which is most of our conversation here, we have to do something else, okay? And what I am suggesting is the following. Despite the mess that we're in, meaning the distrust and the inability to get off, we have to keep our eye on the ball which is those critical issues that those countries need in order to stop fighting. If we don't focus on those, and I'm being fixated myself by doing that, we will never get out of it. And I will repeat, those are for Russia a sense of status and security, 1 and 2. Now, it's important to even differentiate between those and even order them. The first thing Russians need is to feel that the United States is not treating it like a second-class citizen, internationally. That's the number one conversation. The second conversation is the security conversation, and this goes back to a bit of the debate with Gabrielle. I don't think one starts with the security, because the Russians won't even talk serious security until they feel that they're on an even level playing field with the partner across the way. Okay? So number one, status, equal status, eye-level conversation, which I think is possible, by the way. I don't think that is an impossibility. 2 is security. And for our Polish friends here, I don't mean in the least that this is yet another Yalta, or I don't remember which summit, where Europe was carved up. I think it has to be made clear right from the get-go that, that Eastern Europe is not up for sale for the Russians to just do whatever they want from it. I really think the conversation can start purely at the bilateral American-Russian level, okay? But the other critical dimension of going into this, and this will take, I think, just as much work as working on the Russians, by the way, is limits to the Western idea of what we're doing. I think that is the portion, that's the harder portion. There are a lot of issues here that you've all discussed that I've actually tried to work on, including the issue of values and discussion across the globe between values. It's harder to get Westerners to discuss that stuff than others, by the way. It's because, again, I repeat, because of success. Westerners don't just assume that their whole value system and what they've been projecting across the world is all good. It has a lot of good, but we don't know our own limits, okay? So that conversation would have to be done with Westerners, including American leaders, who really understand that they have to do it with that in mind, that there's a limit to what they're trying to do with the way they want to spread their ideology across the world, okay? So and this is more for discussion because I'm not really proposing any silver bullets. My proposal is it has to be, if we want to get out of that war, okay, if we understand the motives, I've done a skim on them today, I'd love to go much deeper, it has to be through USA-Russia strategic talks. Now, I would love people to tell me no, or there are other answers, and maybe there are other ones which we've discussed earlier. I'll get into some of those later, but for me, that's the key, okay? It can't be Euro-Russia, because the Russians don't respect the Europeans as being of equal status. So if we believe in the whole needs argument, and that status is core, then that can't work, because the Russians just don't perceive it that way. Ukraine, Russia, it's not core enough. There's a point I didn't emphasize probably enough. In my view, and this is it's tragic for me to say this, Ukraine is actually the battlefield for the American-Russian competition. Ukraine's not actually the issue. So in a way, and I don't mean this crudely, Ukraine has to be a result of the negotiations, not the negotiations. By the way, the same, I think, identically applies in the Middle East with Gaza. Gaza is not the issue, it's never been the issue. Gaza is the battlefield, it's been the battlefield 3,000 times over. The answers will not come from Gaza. The answers will come from Jerusalem and from Israeli-Palestinian talks and from regional conversations, not from a focus on Gaza. So we have to keep our eye on the ball. If we want to get out of this morass, out of this war, it's got to be USA-Russia talks. Again, I've emphasized status and security, then identity and belonging. All of this we've covered. The USA-Russia talks can be about Europe, but of course the Americans will have to do a very clever dance to make sure the Europeans don't feel like they're being traded in that process. By the way, diplomatically, all that is quite doable. I don't think, if you have intelligent diplomats, none of this is beyond diplomatic capacity. Now, there are problems which I can't answer. The leader level, deceit and performative politics. John, you've really emphasized that we are in a world of very poor leadership. I do think, though, that even leaders, even bad leaders, need material in their hand that serves them in their country. Okay? Even, a Bibi Netanyahu and a Putin need that. So what I am suggesting is people like me and others, if you write these scripts and get it to them, that's why I call it script writers, it is helpful to them in order to move forward. They are not pure ego. Now, they're like a massive amount of ego, but they also care about their legitimacy and legacy as leaders. And therefore, if what I'm saying is correct about basic needs, they will care about those if they are proposed properly to them in order to apply them to their country. What we're really talking about here is a term I very much like, which is not out there that much, but I think we need to start thinking about it. All that I described today is mutual needs satisfaction. You have to satisfy the needs of each other, which leads to mutual respect. I very much think, having worked on the Middle East for decades, that is the only right basis for resolution of all the issues. If you don't start there, we will again do patchwork, band-aids, and end up with more war. Okay? Now, there are other ideas that have come up. Yesterday, Sandeep mentioned a conflict resolution mechanism. I would add to that mutual needs satisfaction, so it's not just open-ended as a kind of baseline. And I agree with Isaiah Berlinjon. Value pluralism is a must in the discussion at some point because of what I said earlier about status and about how the Russians are looking at the West as an entity that is completely disrespecting who they are civilizationally. All you have to do is watch the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin, right? That says it all. Now, I'm not making any judgment as to whether Putin is right or wrong, whether he's lying or whether, and instrumentalizing these things, or how true these things are or not. We have to deal with the way they're coming at us, okay? Now, we're back here to this. This is the front cover you saw, and this is the back cover, and I hope you can see the difference between that, which is more menacing than this. And the reason I'm showing this is because, there's this notions of the coincidence of opposites, and yesterday when you mentioned that Minerva is the idea behind this conference, war and wisdom are in a way opposites. The front and back of this book are opposites. And the reason I'm mentioning it is because these needs, which I've talked about between enemies, okay, and dialogue between enemies, in a way, well, you all know they're in all of us, okay? We are all potent in that direction of becoming aggressive, angry, etc. And the key to me is for all of us to understand those needs better in each of us, even as mediators, by the way, and keep them close, even if it's the enemy, something within us that we don't like. It's something we have to tame, something we have to appropriate, make it ours, so it becomes much more manageable. To me, that's the process of diplomacy, okay, is getting down into the heart of the needs of these actors, trying to figure out ways to have them met. It'll be imperfect, highly imperfect. The Russians will never get everything that they want, nor should the West. And nor should, well, Ukraine, poor Ukraine, what can I say? It's kind of the battlefield. So the idea of moving from a very predatory, angry, inflamed being that causes war to a more tamed creature within us is the point of this whole exercise. And again, I thought it's worth reasserting this quote, which I hope makes a bit more sense now. Our enemies are often former potential friends who've been denied or think they've been denied something. Well, let's not deny them that thing anymore. And one last word, because of the Middle East. So that is the way to go, not Oslo. Oslo was too little, not even too late, just too little. And Sadat did the right thing because he made a big symbolic move, met needs in a big way. One last thing, and I'm writing a piece on this with great dread and trepidation. I think the Israelis need to make a move. Okay, and that's why I was fascinated by the conversation about eternal pessimism, like Shlomo Ben Ami and all that, because I think the Israelis have to step up and say to the region, we want to belong with you, like Sadat did. And therefore, we're going to do X that really matters to the Arabs, not solving Gaza. Okay? Thank you very much.